Our gospel lesson is taken from the 5th chapter of Luke's gospel narrative. We read there from the first verse through the 11th. Continue to listen for the word of God to us today. Once, while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, and we have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that the nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But then Simon Peter saw it, and he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. Well, this passage about the call of the disciples has taken on a bit of an interpretation challenge for me, as my spouse and I have come to a place where we plan to be for a very long time. But here's the truth. We didn't leave everything to come here. I have already chronicled the tales of our move for you, but suffice to say, nowhere near enough was left behind. We hired a moving van. They put an embarrassing amount of our stuff onto a truck, hauled it up the East Coast to the home we bought in Philadelphia. Now, here's the truth. We feel deeply called to be here, but rather than leaving everything, we have in fact settled in and bought stuff. I watched the Marie Kondo program on Netflix the other day. It was just embarrassing. But this is not a story about cleaning out the basement. What does this text, that they left everything and followed him, have to say to us, to you and me, today, in our context? We are called to be Christ's disciples, of that we can be quite sure, but how many of us are going to leave everything? What does this text really imply? What does this text really imply about whether or not we need to leave everything in order to follow Jesus Christ, in order to be faithful disciples? I confess the words "follow me" in Luke's gospel narrative create quite a word association with another story in Luke's gospel, that of a rich young man who came to Jesus asking what he lacked. And Jesus did tell him to sell everything and follow him. If we play around with the word associations in this text, the implications become stronger as we consider what it means to follow Jesus. And perhaps a little concern starts to creep in. What if Jesus is calling you and me to leave everything and follow him? What does that even look like? You don't need me to go through a laundry list of every reason that leaving everything and following Jesus is eminently impractical. And yet the text is there, teasing us with its challenge. They left everything and followed him. You know, I remember learning about this text in vacation Bible school when I was a child, and nobody ever said anything about leaving everything. Sure, we sang our songs about being fishers of men. This was before we learned that inclusive language was a good thing. And we made fish out of pieces of felt, and we ate goldfish crackers. And nobody ever said anything about leaving everything. In fact, the only reference to leaving was at the end of the day with our parents in the station wagon with our felt fish. We just had to follow Jesus. That's all the text told us then. There was nothing in vacation Bible school about leaving everything. You know, at this stage of life, maybe I'll just stick with what they taught me in Bible school. I'll follow Jesus. I'll fish for people. But as far as leaving everything, well, maybe tomorrow. Or maybe next week. Or perhaps we can put that off till next year. And on it goes. But what does the text have to say to us today? Well, sticking strictly within the confines of the text, I ask you this. Where does it say in the text that we have to leave everything and follow Jesus? It doesn't. So why in the world do I find myself so worked up over whether or not discipleship means leaving everything and following Jesus? God knows I have stuff. God knows you have stuff. We have all kinds of baggage we're carrying around. We have obligations. If you have children, you have obligations to them. If your parents require care, you have obligations there. If you have a mortgage, it requires your attention, or at least your money. If you've paid your mortgage, well, 'tis the season for taxes. God knows there are myriad things that command our attention all of the time. Relationships must be nurtured, bills must be paid, supper must be cooked or at least ordered on Grubhub. We can't leave everything behind, can we? We have all kinds of baggage. We have all kinds of baggage. Some of us are carrying around a lifetime of hurt feelings. Some of us are holding to childhood scars. Still others have anxieties about our health or about our children. Or if you have them, your parents. We can't just leave everything and follow Jesus, now can we? Now, I suppose it's possible that in the flurry of activities and anxieties of one's life, the prospect of leaving everything and following Jesus may actually be gaining some appeal. Whatever you're carrying, if it's too heavy, the prospect of leaving everything and following Jesus might actually start to look awfully good. And here's the good news of the gospel. Grace can be found in leaving everything and following Jesus when those bags get too heavy to carry. Setting them down at the feet of Jesus Christ is what grace is all about. You've probably noticed I'm not talking about our stuff anymore, at least not the stuff we're carrying around and moving in moving vans. I'm not sure that we need to worry so much about selling and donating all that stuff, at least not today. If God is not calling you to sell or donate everything that you have, then you don't need to do it. I've said before, and I will say again, I can think of no more absolutely certain way to be positively miserable than to try to live somebody else's call. So I'd say that odds are pretty good that most of you are not being called today to sell all of your stuff and to follow Jesus, unless you are. But for most of us, that calling means to bloom where we are planted, to do the work of God in the corner of the kingdom that we are blessed to occupy. And as we do so, the good news of the gospel is that we can let go of everything that is weighing us down and following Jesus. At least we can do that if our stuff isn't in the way. Now, as I say all of that, I hope none of us are laboring under the assumption that when the disciples did, in fact, decide that they would follow Jesus and leave everything behind, that they never had another care in the world. Oh, no. If you read through the pages of the gospel narrative, you will quickly see that their families don't go away. They're still around with rather interesting commentary on their lifestyles from time to time. Their families are very much in the story. Actually, here's one quick example. Simon Peter's mother-in-law is a part of the story. Did you know that? Healing her is the first thing that Jesus ever does for Simon in Mark's gospel account, before Simon becomes Peter and goes on his way to follow Jesus. Those disciples don't get to unload their obligations any more than we do. But think about it. If we want to live faithfully with the vocations of marriage and family and friendship, we have to look at leaving everything in a very different way. You see, following Jesus doesn't necessarily change your location so much as it changes your perspective and the way you see the world and the things you are called to do and how you fit into life. Following Jesus means seeing the world differently. I think sometimes it's useful to look at the progression of the story and to see the way it comes together. The disciples did not decide to follow Jesus and then find out right away that they had received abundant blessings. No, Jesus got on the boat with them, told them to do things a little differently, and then they caught a load of fish. Abundant fish, lots of fish. They were blessed. Then they saw from whom those blessings flowed, and from there they left everything to follow Jesus. I think when we keep in mind who the source of our blessings is, then we are able better to follow the one who calls us. I think it's a good thing it went in that order too, because the gospel narratives make it pretty clear that following Jesus then in turn brings its own set of problems. Following Jesus brings its own set of anxieties. It's good to know up front that what you're doing is going to be worth it, because, let's be honest, it's not always easy following Jesus, is it? Well, look at Simon Peter since we're talking about him. He became so frightened and so scared of the consequences of following Jesus that when it mattered most, he pretended not to know him. Or consider Matthew, formerly known as Levi, a tax collector and a crooked businessman who saw in the light of faith not only that he had to make some changes in his life going forward, but he needed to change what he had done in the past after he started to follow Jesus. You know, if you came in here planning to unload some of the complexities of life this morning, you might even be a little bit skeptical now. I mean, why bother if we learn that we're only going to face more burdens when we do follow Jesus? If it turns out our life will only be more complex as we consider the implications of the gospel for how we earn our living, how we relate to our family, how we relate to the world? Why would we leave everything and follow Jesus when it turns out that all that we're inheriting is a great deal more complexity, as we are now faced with the obligations of the gospel in our lives as we seek to live in our very modern context? Why indeed? Well, I know you all expect that this is a straw man and I'm going to knock him down right now, so here is it. We do so because Jesus Christ offers us hope. Hope for our individual lives and hope for the world. The reality is, and you know this all too well, you can't walk out on your life, not with any degree of integrity whatsoever. But you can leave behind other things. You can leave behind the hurts and pains that accumulate if we insist on carrying them with us. You can leave behind broken promises and bad decisions. You can leave behind feelings of guilt that you never seem quite to be able to escape. Do you want to know what you can leave behind? You can leave behind the burden of sin. There is as vivid an image of grace as I know in the movie The Mission. As it begins, a slave trader bursts in upon his lover and his brother together, and in a fit of rage, he kills his brother. He is subsequently eaten up with feelings of remorse and guilt. We call that being convicted by one's sin. And so he goes to a priest seeking absolution for his sin so that he may find some peace in his life. As it happens, the priest he goes to, even though he knows who the man is, that he is rich and powerful, is not cowed by the man's influence, and so he refuses to give the man cheap grace. He refuses to offer him absolution unless he will do penance. So what he offers him is that he will absolve him of his sins, but only after the slave trader journeys with him into the interior of the Latin American country where the movie is set. And it is not enough for him simply to journey among those whom he once enslaved and captured. He must carry with him on his back the tools of his trade. And so as he travels through the jungles that he has pillaged for slaves, he carries with him the armaments that he used in his kidnapping of the native people, all of the breastplates and swords and guns. Each one of them is heavy, and together they are weighing him down. Onward he goes. And the scene of grace finally occurs when he is climbing up the side of a steep ravine. Below him there is a raging river, and then it begins to rain. He starts slipping, surely toward his death, the literal weight of his sin dragging him down. And when the priest cannot wait 1 second longer, he cuts the rope holding the man to the burden, and the weapons crash to the valley floor below, and the slave trader surges upward, relieved of his burden. That is what grace is like. That is what it means to leave everything behind. But even as I say that, even as I share that story, I am aware that sometimes letting go of baggage is very hard. Sometimes we hold on so tightly to the very things that weigh us down the most. We protect our hurts and our fears because we are afraid that if we let our guard down, we will get hurt worse the next time. Sometimes we are unable to let go of everything and follow Jesus because we don't know how to let go. And even still, perhaps especially then, there is the promise of healing. God will always be with us, even when we cannot yet leave what we most need to leave in order to follow Jesus Christ. Because God never gives up. We, even if we are holding on to what hurts us the most, can always rest assured that we will be held within the love of God that is more powerful than any chain can ever be. Because you see, what God promises us in Jesus Christ is a new life. The reality is that none of us ever lets go of sin on our own. To the extent that we are able to let go of sin, confess our sins, and move on, it is through the grace of God that we are able to do so. So if you cannot yet let go of past hurts, if you cannot forgive yourself or someone else, keep praying and keep following Jesus in the sure and certain knowledge that someday you will. The gospel of grace tells us that Christ's shoulders are quite large enough to carry any burden that we may hold. And Jesus says to us even now, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Let me tell you another story. This is the story of a man's journey, and it is a journey into grace. John Newton went to sea at the age of 11 years old. At the age of 19, he was drafted into the British Navy. He found life on board intolerable, and so he deserted his post. He was captured, he was publicly whipped, and then he was demoted. He found that too intolerable, and so he asked for a transfer to a slave ship, where he himself was in turn abused by the captain of that ship. Then, at the age of 23, he was rescued by a friend of his father, and he became the captain of his own ship, where he too plied the slave trade, capturing people and selling them into bondage. In the midst of a terrible storm, with his ship on the edge of sinking, he cried out to God, "Lord, have mercy upon us." And the ship survived the storm. And later he came to believe that God was calling him through the voice of that storm. He converted to Christianity, and he didn't yet give up the slave trade. The captives on his ship were treated better than other ships, but make no mistake about it, he was still a slave trader, and he still sold people into bondage. He made some changes in the way he did business, but it was still slavery. The idea that John Newton changed in a heartbeat is one of the great myths of Christianity. The reality is, his journey into grace took much longer. Like everyone's, it took a lifetime. In time, Newton became ill, and that is when he gave up the slave trade. He became the surveyor of tides in a seaside community, and it was there that he met a preacher who captured his imagination, and in turn, he himself decided to become a minister. It was also there that through the grace of God, this slave trader turned minister preached to William Wilberforce, who in turn led the campaign to abolish slavery in the United Kingdom. Throughout the course of his ministry, he said that he hoped that the memory of who he had been and what he had done would forever convict him of his sin and remind him of the grace of God. It was then that he wrote the great hymn, Amazing Grace. There is a verse that I have never seen in any modern hymn. It reads like this: "When this flesh and heart shall fail and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace." So friends, to answer the question, does Jesus command us to drop everything and go? I have come to believe instead that rather he invites us to trust that his grace is sufficient so that we can leave everything and follow him.